Now we're going to tie the banking and the politics together. When the Jekyll Island meeting took place in 1910, William Howard Taft was president, and Taft disapproved of the Aldrich plan for a central bank, and so the bankers decided that he needed to be dumped, and the man they chose to replace him was Woodrow Wilson. And before Woodrow Wilson ran for president, he met with Bernard Baruch, who was part of this cartel, and he agreed to do 4 things if he was elected president. He would lend an ear to advice on who should be in his cabinet. He would lend an ear to advice if war broke out in Europe, and he would approve an income tax and a central bank. Now, the problem was how to get this stiff-looking professor from Princeton elected over the very popular incumbent, William Howard Taft. To accomplish that purpose, J.P. Morgan and Company put money behind the former Republican president, Teddy Roosevelt, on the short-lived Bull Moose ticket. That split Republican votes between Taft and Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic candidate, won the presidency with only 42% of the popular vote. Now watch Wilson's political career take off after he's made this agreement with the bankers. In 1910, he's at Princeton, a political unknown, no political experience. They had to give this guy some experience politically to make him a credible presidential candidate. So in 1911, he became governor of New Jersey. Then in 1912, with 1 year of political experience, he's elected president with the full power of the media, which was newspapers back then, behind him. 1913, his first year in office, income tax and the Federal Reserve become law. 1914, World War I begins. 1915, the Lusitania goes down, and he hides that manifest. 1916, he is re-elected president on the campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war." But as soon as he's re-elected, he moves to get us into the war, and he gets the declaration of war in 1917. 1918, Germany surrenders as our entry into the war has turned the balance of power against them. And in 1919, Woodrow Wilson travels to the Paris Peace Conference, which is settling the aftermath of that war. Now, who does Wilson appoint to head the U.S. delegation to the Paris Peace Conference? Paul Warburg.
Oh, no.
According to him, only Warburg is qualified to run the Fed, and only Warburg is qualified to represent America at the Peace Conference. And who is his chief financial economic advisor at the conference? Bernard Baruch, same man he made those promises to, and always at his side is the banker's front man, Edward Mandell House. You know, it's interesting, when Wilson went to the Paris Peace Conference, he didn't bring a single member of his own party, the Democratic Party, with him. Not one congressman, not one senator went with him, just the bankers and their entourage. Now, his chief proposal, of course, famously was the League of Nations, and many people think that Woodrow Wilson created the idea of the League of Nations. Actually, it was not. It was House and the bankers. Now we see House at the Paris Peace Conference. Ray Stanley Baker was Woodrow Wilson's official biographer. He said this: practically nothing, not a single idea in the covenant of the League was original with the president. And Charles Seymour, who was Edward Mandell House's official biographer, said, Wilson approved the House draft almost in its entirety, and his own rewriting of it was practically confined to phraseology. Now, what were the bankers after with the League of Nations? They were after a world government. Now, some people might say, well, wait a minute, Mr. Perloff, at the beginning of this, you were saying these guys wanted an all-powerful world government. But the League of Nations was not powerful at all. It's very weak. That's right, because the bankers understood this time-worn principle. If you want to boil a frog, don't put them in boiling water. If you want to boil a frog, you got to put them in lukewarm. Like with the income tax, starting at 1%, you start them off with a weak world government and just gradually increase its power, and they won't know they've been boiled. But how did America react to the Versailles Treaty, which created the League of Nations? Well, the Founding Fathers had wisely stipulated that any treaty had to be ratified by the Senate. The President couldn't just go out and make a treaty by himself. The Senate rejected the Versailles Treaty. We did not join the League of Nations. Because members of Congress said, well, look, we helped win the war, but how come we got to join this organization that might threaten our sovereignty one day? So how do the bankers react when they get the news, and they're still in Paris, right? They get the news that the Senate has rejected the treaty. They were really ticked off. So they held a series of meetings in Paris, hosted by Edward Mandell House, culminating with a dinner at the Majestic Hotel in Paris. And at this final dinner, they resolved to form a new organization in America whose purpose would be to bring America into the realm of world government. And that organization was incorporated 2 years later in New York City as the Council on Foreign Relations. If you look at the original membership roster of the Council, you'll find that almost everybody on it was either a banker or a lawyer working for J.P. Morgan. The founding president of the CFR was John W. Davis, who was Morgan's personal attorney. The founding vice president was Paul Cravath, attorney for J.P. Morgan, and the founding chairman was Russell Leffingwell, a senior partner in J.P. Morgan and Company. Don't you think it's odd that a foreign policy association should consist of just bankers and lawyers working for J.P. Morgan? Well, they thought it looked funny too. So to diversify their roster, they invited a number of college professors to join. But guess what? The professors all came from universities that were indebted to J.P. Morgan for large endowments, and they're all men who are carefully screened and can be counted on to attend dinners and meetings at the council and then return to their home campuses and tell their students that if America were enlightened, she would join the League of Nations. By the late 1920s, the Rockefellers had brought their people into the council, and David Rockefeller was the chairman for many years and still is the honorary chairman of the CFR. Now, how does the council influence American foreign policy? One way is through its many books, which are pretty likely to get glowing reviews in the New York Times Book Review section, and also its journal Foreign Affairs, which Time Magazine actually calls the most influential journal in print. A lot of people haven't heard of it, but for our State Department, it's almost like the Bible. They say that if you want to know what America's going to be doing tomorrow, just read Foreign Affairs today. But the most important way the council impacts American policy is by directly supplying cabinet and sub-cabinet level personnel to Washington. Now, since the council was founded, 21 secretaries of defense have been drawn for the ranks of the council. Now, that includes what they used to call the War Department. Also, 19 secretaries of the Treasury, 17 secretaries of state, and 15 CIA directors have been chosen from the roster of the Council on Foreign Relations. Bill Clinton picked 12 of his cabinet members from the council's roster. Now, bear in mind, this is not a big organization. When Kennedy was president, they only had about 900 members. And today they're up to more than 4,000, yet this small group continues to dominate cabinets. And I laid that out in the Shadows of Power, and also wrote an article not too long ago for the New American, which we have reprints in back of, that Kip has there, on how the council dominates the Obama administration. So this is a continuing process. Hillary Clinton recently said this. She said this, Secretary of State Clinton said, she said this, quote, I have often been to the mothership, referring to the council's headquarters in New York City, but it's good to have an outpost of the council right down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the council, so this means I won't have to go so far to be told what we should be doing. She was, they have a branch, you see, in Washington, D.C., and she was speaking at that branch office of the CFR. Now, what foreign policy programs has the council specifically created? Let's take 3 quick examples from after World War II. What succeeded the failed League of Nations? What was the new organization? The United Nations. Now, when I went to public school, my public school teacher told us this. She said, well, you know, boys and girls, here's how the UN got created. After World War II, the countries of the world were all sick and tired of war, so they decided they were all going to get together and form a new organization that would create peace. That's not how it happened. The UN got started with a group of CFR members in our State Department, and they called themselves the Informal Agenda Group. Now, doesn't that seem like an innocuous, innocent-sounding name? These guys were smart. They knew that the Senate had rejected the League of Nations. They didn't want any snoopy senators looking into what they were doing, so they picked this very bland name, and but they created the concept of the UN. They called it United Nations. They called in 3 attorneys, all members of the CFR, who said their plan was constitutional. Then they had an audience with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who approved their plan and announced it to the public that same day. And then he made the founding of the UN his top priority of post-war planning. And when the UN held its founding conference at San Francisco in 1945, 47 of the American delegates were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. It was their show all the way. How about the Marshall Plan? This was the plan to help Europe after World War II had stricken it. Now, your history books say the Marshall Plan was thought up by General George Marshall, who announced it in a Harvard commencement speech. Well, he announced it in that speech, but he had nothing to do with thinking it up. The Marshall Plan was created at a study group at the Council on Foreign Relations with a young David Rockefeller as its secretary. And originally they were going to call it the Truman Plan and have President Truman announce it, but they deliberated and they said, you know what, if Truman announces it, he's a Democrat, maybe the Republicans will start saying this is a New Deal for Europe and oppose it, saying it's a big Democratic spending scheme. So they had General Marshall announce it because they thought he would be perceived as politically neutral, even though he wasn't. Now, there's some sinister aspects to the Marshall Plan. For one thing, our tax dollars went to these multinational corporations they were associated with to push unwanted goods on the Europeans. But there was a even more sinister aspect to the Marshall Plan. The man on the left is John J. McCloy of the Council on Foreign Relations, and President Truman made him the man in charge of dispensing funds in Europe for the Marshall Plan. The man on the right is Jean Monnet, Frenchman, who was called the father of Europe by Time magazine. He was the founder of the Common Market. And in 1947, Jean Monnet sent his delegates to John J. McCloy, and John J. McCloy put unlimited Marshall Plan funds at their disposal to start a European Union movement, to fund a European Union youth movement, to fund the first meeting that was called the European Council, which led to the Common Market, which led to the EU, to fund the political campaigns of politicians who would advocate a European Union. This is the beginnings of the EU. It happened in 1947 with our tax dollars. We were never even told about it. Now this guy McCloy, on the left, true establishment man. When he came back from Europe, he became chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, chairman of the Rockefeller's Chase Manhattan Bank, and he was also second president of the World Bank. And I'm sure you've all heard of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. And what your history books say is that the World Bank and IMF were created at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. That technically that's true, but before Bretton Woods, all the original groundwork and planning was done by the Council on Foreign Relations Economic and Finance Group. In other words, the Council on Foreign Relations is like a little factory of U.S. foreign policy, but how many people have even heard of it? By the way, what is the purpose of the World Bank and IMF? We're told that they're there to help out these poor countries that have debt problems. That's one way of putting it. The truth is they're loan guarantee, it's a loan guarantee scheme for the rich private banks. Here's how it works. Let's say that Citibank, or National City Bank as it was called before, after World War II, wants to make a loan to Argentina. We're a little worried that Argentina might be shaky. But they're not worried now because they've got the World Bank. Here's what happens. They loan the money to Argentina. Argentina is making interest payments to National City Bank. And then 1 month comes along, they say, well, you know, guys, our economy is pretty bad in Argentina. We can't make this month's interest payment. What happens? The World Bank takes U.S. tax dollars, gives it to Argentina, which gives it to National City Bank, and National City Bank never risks losing a dime. All of its bad loans guaranteed by the American public. And I'm not making this up. I'm going to quote Senator Jesse Helms, former chairman of the Council of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He said this in the Senate: "The New York banks have found important profit centers in lending to countries plunged into debt. This has been an essentially riskless game for the banks because the IMF and World Bank have stood ready to bail the banks out with our taxpayers' money." A.K. Chesterton, the noted British political observer, said this: "The World Bank and International Monetary Fund were not incubated by hard-pressed governments, but by a supranational money power which could afford to look ahead to the shaping of a post-war world that would serve its interests." And as usual, by the way, it's about more than money. It's about more than profit. It's also about forcing policies on foreign governments. When Boris Yeltsin was in trouble in Russia, the World Bank and IMF came up with $5 billion. He got reelected. It's amazing what $5 billion will do for your popularity. And then, of course, the bankers can simply dictate political terms in return for these loans. Now, we're going to talk about what they're up to today, these internationalists and globalists, this cartel I've been talking about. But first I want to talk about just one more aspect of American history, that's the Vietnam War, because it was a very tragic period in our history, and I don't think in the last century anything changed our culture more than the Vietnam War. Now, if you look to the establishment publications for an explanation of this Vietnam War, they like to call it a quagmire. It sounds very intellectual, that word. It means swamp. I once did a Google search, and I matched the search terms quagmire in Vietnam. There were more than 1 million sites that matched those two terms. What do they mean by quagmire? What they're saying is, they say this is how they explain the war in Vietnam. They say it was all the military's fault. The military underestimated the resolve of the Vietnamese people, their nationalism, and their support for the communist leader Ho Chi Minh. So it's in 100,000 troops, that didn't work. 200,000 troops, that didn't work. 500,000 troops, that didn't work. But those darn patriotic hawks, they just wouldn't wouldn't pull out, and so the war dragged on for 14 years. We finally lost, and they say, well, the war was just unwinnable, you know. There's no way to win the war in Vietnam, and it's just a big quagmire, big mess. Nothing can be done about it. Well, that's their explanation. Now let's look at what really happened in Vietnam. First key to understanding Vietnam is to give it some context. Now, in World War II, America fought against two military giants in a two-front war, Germany and Japan, and let's give credit, they were tough. They had tough navies, tough armies, and tough air forces, yet we defeated those two military empires in just 3.5 years with the help of our allies. Yet in Vietnam, we fought a tiny country for 14 years, and we lost. This doesn't make sense. Now, in 1968, 12 senior retired U.S. military officers were separately interviewed. Each one of them agreed the war in Vietnam could be won in a matter of months. How? Well, they pointed out that the communists were getting 90% of their supplies through Haiphong Harbor. They said if we're serious about winning this war, why don't we blockade it? Those supplies were going down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and President Johnson was occasionally allowing that trail to be bombed. This guy said, you know, historically, that's not a good way to stop supplies. They're just going to pull off the trail and wait till the bombs have been dropped. That if you want to stop that, the flow of supplies, you've got to block that trail, put U.S. Marines on the mountain passes overlook the trail, that'll stop the flow. Also, the Secretary of Defense at that time was Robert McNamara, member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He only allowed the Air Force to hit 6% of the strategic targets it requested to attack. 94% were denied by McNamara, who went on from the Defense Department to become head of the World Bank. Nice club these guys are. Also, the rules of engagement, perhaps the most important factor of all, required 26 pages of small print, and the Congressional Record was finally declassified. The rules of engagement in Vietnam said you should not shoot at the enemy first, you should shoot at you first. The rules of engagement said if an enemy fighter plane, a MiG, was on the ground, you couldn't bomb it. It had to be up in the air and showing hostile intent. If a missile-to-air launch site was under construction, you could not bomb it. It had to be fully operational. Now imagine if we had fought World War II like that. Let's go back to the jaunty days of Britain's Royal Air Force. Let's say that the RAF is flying over Germany. One of the pilots says, "Oh, Wing Commander, there appear to be about 50 Messerschmitt fighters below. Shall we commence a strike, sir?" And the Wing Commander says, "I know, chaps. Wouldn't be cricket, you know. We've got to give those Jerrys a fair warning first. Let them get up in the air first, I say. Let them take the first shot at us, I say. You know, Mr. Churchill's given the strictest orders to fight this war in a most sportsmanlike manner." Well, let's face it, we didn't fight World War II like that. And if we fought World War II under the same rules as Vietnam, we would have lost World War II. We lost in Vietnam not because the Vietnamese people loved communism. We lost because of the rules of engagement. So the question is, who was responsible for this mess? It was not the military. When did President Kennedy make the fateful decision to send the first 10,000 troops to Vietnam? It was October of 1961, on the advice of this man, Walt Rostow of the Council on Foreign Relations and the State Department, who had just returned from Vietnam on a fact-finding mission. Now some people might think, well, if Rostow gave Kennedy the advice to send troops to Vietnam, he must have been a great anti-communist. To the contrary, the guy's family lived here in Connecticut. I've been told that they were called the Red Rostows. It's just unofficial, that's what I've been told. But I do know that two of his aunts were members of the U.S. Communist Party. His father, a Marxist revolutionary in Russia. His brother, Eugene Debs Rostow, named for the Socialist Party leader, Eugene Debs. This guy, Walt Rostow, tried to get in the State Department 3 times during the Eisenhower years, and each time was rejected as a security risk to the USA. And the only way the Kennedys could get him into the State Department was by firing the head of security for the State Department, Otto Atepka. A whole book has been written just on that subject. Now, some people might think, well, maybe he wasn't an anti-communist, but I bet he was a great patriot, wasn't he? Well, here's what he wrote the year before he gave Kennedy that advice in a book of his. Quote, "It is a legitimate American national objective to see removed from all nations, including the United States, the right to use substantial military force to pursue their own interests. Since this right is the root of national sovereignty, it is therefore an American interest to see an end to nationhood, as it has been historically defined, an end to nationhood." There's a classic CFR statement. Now, we talked about the Tonga Gulf Resolution, and we mentioned that it was prematurely written. It was written before the Tonga Gulf incident even took place. Who wrote it prematurely? It was the Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs, a very key position at that time, William P. Bundy of the Council on Foreign Relations. So you might think, well, if Bundy wrote the Tonga Gulf Resolution, it must have been because he was an anti-communist. To the contrary, you know what he was doing back in the 50s? He's head of the Alger Hiss Defense Fund. Alger Hiss, the notorious communist spy. This guy was handing secrets to the Soviet Union. He denied it at the time, but the FBI has released Venona transcripts proving he was a Soviet spy. No self-respecting anti-communist would rush to his defense. But you might think, well, maybe he wasn't such an anti-communist, but wasn't he a Yankee Doodle boy? Actually, you know what he became after he left the State Department? Robert McNamara got to become president of the World Bank. William P. Bundy was appointed by David Rockefeller as editor of Foreign Affairs, this nation's leading journal calling for an end to American sovereignty, so patriot he was not. Finally, in regards to Vietnam, why did President Johnson suddenly begin sending hundreds of thousands of troops in 1965 to Vietnam? Why did he suddenly escalate the war after being re-elected? He did it because he was told to do it by a secret clique of advisors nicknamed the Wise Men, 14 senior advisors, 12 of whom were members of the CFR. Some people would say, well, that's just a kooky conspiracy theory. It's not. Actually, you can read about the Wise Men in the book, The Wise Men, by Isaacson and Thomas, who are themselves members of the Council on Foreign Relations. And they're not criticizing these men, they're praising them as wise statesmen. The leader of the Wise Men, who was most vocal in demanding that the war in Vietnam be escalated, was Dean Acheson. So you might think, well, if Acheson told President Johnson to escalate the war in Vietnam, he must have been a great anti-communist. To the contrary, back in the 1920s, Joseph Stalin, the brutal dictator of the Soviet Union, was looking for a U.S. attorney to represent Soviet interests in America. The man he picked, a young lawyer named Dean Acheson. He was on Joseph Stalin's payroll. His law partner was Donald Hiss, brother of the Soviet spy Alger Hiss, and in the State Department, he surrounded himself with members of the Communist Party, USA, and security risks. Anti-communist he was not. You know what his son-in-law was? His son-in-law was William P. Bundy, who drafted the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. It was a small clique of men that got us into Vietnam. And realized that the CFR clique, which got us into Vietnam, wrote the rules of engagement, making it impossible to win. You realize that what happened in Vietnam was not a quagmire, but happened just the way they planned it. And I'll bet you, when they looked out their window, these America haters, and they saw college students burning the American flag, they probably toasted each other. Now, what is the establishment's agenda today? Well, they're still promising us peace and prosperity. And how are they going to bring that about? Well, they say that the peace will come about through the war on terror and the prosperity through, largely through trade agreements. We'll do the trade first. Undoubtedly heard of many of these North American Free Trade Agreement, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, World Trade Organization, Free Trade Area of the Americas, which is a proposed extension of NAFTA to the entire Western Hemisphere, and Security and Prosperity Partnership, which we will cover momentarily. You probably also noticed that jobs are disappearing in America. Our steel industry wiped out, textile industry, electronics industry all wiped out. Where are the jobs going? It's no mystery, they're going overseas. And why is that? I'll explain it very simply. It used to be that a woman would go to Walmart, see two items, similar items, one made in China, one made in America. The American item would cost $5. The Chinese item, which had a tariff on it, tariff is a charge which is import duty on a foreign good, would cost $4.50. And the woman would say, well, the Chinese item is 50 cents cheaper, but the American one looks a lot nicer, I'm going to buy that. But then we get into the World Trade Organization in 1994. Our tariff structure is eradicated. And now the same woman goes back to Walmart, sees the same two products. The one made in America still costs $5, but the one made in China now costs about $1.50, representing the virtual slave labor that made it. She says, well, I can't resist a bargain. I can get 3 Chinese ones for the cost of 1 American one. So what happens? The American manufacturer either has to move his factory overseas or he goes out of business. And that is the story of what's happened to American industry since we got into the World Trade Organization. Now, I taped the original hearings and congressional debate on the GATT Treaty, which got us into the World Trade Organization. And the backers of the treaty were promising, hey, our trade deficit's not going to rise. You know, we're just going to export and import, make everybody prosperous. Well, the very next year, 1995, after getting into the organization, our trade deficit hit a record $103 billion, and last year it was up to $558 billion. The biggest thing we export in this country is jobs. How many votes does America have in the World Trade Organization? Well, Europe got 30 votes, Africa 35, and we got 1 vote. our voting power in the World Trade Organization is equal to the island of the Maldives with a population of 200,000, which means that these other countries can force us by majority vote to keep our exports out of their countries if they want, and force us to accept their exports. Who pays for the World Trade Organization? As you can imagine, the American taxpayer is required to pay the lion's share because we're the richest country. That's also called taxation without representation. Who created the World Trade Organization? I think it was the average Joes like us. Hey Ralph, you know, I think it would be a swell idea if we had a trade union with Canada and Mexico. That's a good idea, Bob. Let's write to our congressman and suggest that. That is not how these things get created. They're created from the top down, not from the people up. Now, again, I taped the hearings on the GATT Treaty in 1994, and the Council on Foreign Relations sent one of their big shots, the banker Felix Droheiten, down to talk to the senators who were assembled there, and he said, gentlemen, if you fail to pass this treaty, I'm afraid that the markets may react adversely. Well, Senator James Exxon of Nebraska said, well, Mr. Droheiten, you know, we hear in the Senate, we hear from you economists making these dire predictions all the time. Nothing ever comes of them. Well, nothing comes of them. That very same day, Alan Greenspan at the Fed raised short-term interest rates a whopping 0.75%, which caught the stock market completely by surprise. The market plunged for 4 straight days. The country was getting nervous. Congress was getting nervous. And finally, Bob Dole ran over to the White House, stood next to Bill Clinton, and vowed the GATT Treaty will receive bipartisan support. And the stock market automatically rebounded. These guys use the stock market to get what they want. Now, Senator Ernest Hollings was chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, which held the hearings on the GATT Treaty, and he knew what was going on. Here's what he said on the floor of the Senate. They, meaning multinational corporations and banks, have got the Council on Foreign Relations up there in New York. If you ever run for president, they'll invite you. You can get out, you can get their contributions, you can get the support. I've been there, I know what I'm talking about. But that is what our quote-unquote friend, David Rockefeller, and all that got that steam together. It's not about jobs, it's about money. Well, they're getting rich and we're losing jobs. They're debilitating and destroying us. Now, I would take it further than Senator Hollings. It's about more than money. What is the true purpose of these international trade accords? Henry Kissinger, one of the biggest big shots in the CFR, said this, that NAFTA will represent the most creative step taken towards a new world order, taken by any group of countries since the end of the Cold War. And David Rockefeller said, everything is in place after 500 years to build a true new world in the Western Hemisphere. But I think this quote from Andrew Redding of the World Policy Institute summarizes it best. NAFTA will signal the formation, however tentatively, of a new political unit, North America. With economic integration will come political integration. By whatever name, this is an incipient form of international government. Following the lead of the Europeans, North Americans should begin considering formation of a continental parliament. Watch what they did in Europe now. They started out with a common market, which was an economic alliance, like NAFTA, and Europeans were told, hey, all we want to do is make people more prosperous. But as soon as they got into that entanglement, they were told, oh, look, now we're in this economic alliance. We've got conflicts over trade unions, product quality, prices, and we need common laws. So they formed the European Parliament. Now they have the European Union, and national sovereignty is becoming a thing of the past. And that's exactly what they want for North America. How does the war on terror play into this? Well, we're all against terrorism. And most people don't realize that the concept of Homeland Security was not created, the concept, not created after 9/11. It was created before 9/11 by the U.S. Commission on National Security, a 12-member task force, 9 of whose members were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. And they recommended what they call a National Homeland Security Agency, which is the very phrase that George Bush used 9 days after 9/11. Oh, a concern a lot of us have is who's going to be ultimately defined as a terrorist. Now, one clue to that came from a Newsweek columnist in Anna Quindlen. After 9/11, she wrote a column called "The Terrorists Here at Home." Who was she referring to? The pro-life movement, people who oppose abortion, right? Here's what she wrote. There's no real ideological difference between these people, pro-lifers, and the people who flew planes into the World Trade Center. One of the leaders of Operation Rescue once sent his followers a letter that concluded, return to the training so that God may use you. Sound familiar? Here she's mixing images of the World Trade Center with the pro-life movement, and she's suggesting that pro-lifers be classified as terrorists now. There's a connection between the trade agreements and the war on terror. Sure, they're both being used to promote a North American Union. Robert Pastor of the Council on Foreign Relations is considered the father of this concept of the North American Union. Here's what he wrote. in foreign affairs. Security fears serve as a catalyst for deeper integration. That would require new structures to assure mutual security. The Department of Homeland Security should expand its mission to include continental security, a shift best achieved by incorporating Mexican and Canadian perspectives and personnel into its design and operation. And it's coming to life in the Security and Prosperity Partnership with North America. President Bush got it kicked off. He met with President Fox of Mexico and Prime Minister Martin of Canada in 2005, and they began what is called the Security and Prosperity Partnership, laying the groundwork for a North American Union. And President Fox was soon boasting that we'd be having North American ID cards, and we'd have our own monetary unit, just like the Europeans have the euro. He said we would have the Amero. Well, the only person who mentioned this in the mainstream media, who even mentioned it, was Lou Dobbs of CNN. He said President Bush signed a formal agreement that will end the United States as we know it, and he took the step without approval from either the U.S. Congress or the people of the United States. And as most of you know, Lou Dobbs has now been outed from CNN. And I just want to say that the only reason this North American Union has not gone forward is due to the actions of alert patriots who saw the writing on the wall. By the way, are these regional blocs like the European Union, SPP, or North American Union, are they ends in themselves? No, they're just stepping stones to a one-world dictatorship. Joseph Stalin understood the concept. He said this: populations will more readily abandon their national loyalties to a vague regional loyalty than they will for a world authority. Later, the regionals can be brought all the way into a single world dictatorship. Zbigniew Brzezinski, another big shot in the CFR, said this: we cannot leap into world government in one quick step. The precondition for genuine globalization is progressive regionalization. Got it? NAFTA, North American Union, European Union. Step by step, they're patient. Now, I'm just about done. But there's an objection that can be raised to what I've been saying, so I'll become my own critic again. Mr. Perloff, hey, look, all the stuff you've been talking about tonight, we know it can't be true because in America we've got freedom of the press. It's right there in the Constitution. Oh, we have a very diverse media, Mr. Perloff. Now, you live in Boston. You can read the Boston Globe, but if you don't like it, read the New York Times or get your news in one of these fine weekly formats. And if you don't like to read, which you probably don't, Mr. Perloff, you can watch television news. Now, Mr. Perloff, look at all that diversity up there, boy. Now, are you seriously trying to tell me that all these stories you've been telling tonight were missed by these media organs and all the reporters? That's not credible, Mr. Perloff. Look, why should we listen to a goofball like you? We can turn to a tried and trusted source of news and information like the New York Times. Well, let me make it very clear that the establishment understood from the very beginning the only way to get the American people to go along with their political agenda was to control the media. Now, I have a chapter on the media in my book, The Shadows of Power, but just to take the Times as an example, in the 19th century, the Rothschilds sent one of their fiscal agents, August Belmont. That was not his real name, but they thought that would sound snappy to Americans. August Belmont and J.P. Morgan offered millions of dollars to Adolph Ochs if he would buy a newspaper that would represent their interests. And he took that money and he bought a tiny newspaper called the New York Times, whose circulation at that time was only 9,000. But with the power of the House of Rothschild and Morgan behind him, Ochs turned it into the world's most powerful newspaper. He bought up the best editors, writers, channels of distribution. They moved it to what's now called Times Square. And from him, the ownership passed on to Sulzberger, Dreyfus, and Sulzberger, all members of the Council on Foreign Relations. If you look at the history of the New York Times, it consistently supported the CFR's viewpoint. For example, when Paul Warburg was nominated as vice chairman of the Fed and senators were complaining about it, the New York Times editorialized what a great patriot he was. See the guy next to Fidel Castro? That is New York Times reporter Herbert L. Matthews. Herbert L. Matthews, was his articles in the New York Times that convinced Americans that Castro was not a communist, but the George Washington of Cuba. Herbert L. Matthews, member of the Council on Foreign Relations. The man on the lower left is New York Times editor Leslie Gelb, one of the key men behind the Pentagon Papers, which were used to demoralize Americans during the Vietnam War. So some of them might think, well, if he exposed the Pentagon, would he expose the Council on Foreign Relations? Not likely. He was its president for 10 years. You see, when you talk about the New York Times and the Council on Foreign Relations, you're talking about two branches of the establishment. You're talking about a foreign policy branch and a media branch. They are not going to expose each other. Some people might say this, well, Mr. Perloff, I don't depend on just one source of news and information. I mean, I get my news from America Online in the morning, but if I don't trust the story, I can always check it against CNN on TV. And then I get my Time magazine later in the week. But there's a problem with that. You see, America Online, CNN, and Time magazine are all owned by one corporation, Time Warner, which also owns Sports Illustrated and People magazine, Money magazine, and 130 magazines. I don't even have space on that board to show. You know, what at first glance appears to be a diverse media is not so diverse. I come from Boston, but most Bostonians don't realize the Boston Globe is owned by the New York Times, just as the Washington Post owns Newsweek, Disney owns ABC, CBS owns the big publishing house Simon & Schuster. You know, when you take all the major movie studios, major radio and television networks, major newspapers and magazines, you'll find they're owned by about a dozen huge multinational corporations which interlock at the top with executive membership in the Council on Foreign Relations, and this enables them to create a false impression of consensus as to what the reality is in the political world. And confirming this is the man himself, David Rockefeller. These are comments he made at a private dinner. Unbeknownst to Rockefeller, two French journalists crashed the dinner and reported his remarks, and we've translated them back from French. Here's what he said. "We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we'd been subject to the bright lights of publicity during these years. But the world is now more sophisticated, prepared to march towards a world government who will never again know war, but only what?
Peace and prosperity.
Peace and prosperity." Still using that same terminology. Wow. Well, that pretty much wraps up my presentation. Now, what do you do about these guys? Well, I just want to, as a word of encouragement, I just want to mention, we have a weapon they don't have, which is truth. They have money, we have truth. I'll put myself behind the truth anytime over money. I do want to recommend considering membership in the John Birch Society, which is fighting to preserve our Constitution against the things you guys are doing. They have a fine magazine, The New American. I've written several articles for them this year in it. Last one on the Spanish-American War. I do have my book here, by the way, just explain what's at my table, is Shadows of Power, which it's an older book, but it summarizes a lot of things we've gone over tonight. Also, my books on creation versus evolution are there. And I have a music CD. I'll just explain, you know, as a hippie, the music was really impacting the culture all in the wrong direction, so I decided, let's have some politically incorrect music. So this is a music CD with a tribute to Vietnam vets. We have Vietnamese actors playing the Viet Cong on that, and a tribute to homeschoolers with homeschooled kids singing the chorus. And it's 12 politically incorrect songs sung by 7 different lead vocalists that we made at a Christian music studio up in Boston. And I would never ask anybody to buy music without hearing it, so there's a CD player there. That concludes my presentation. Now I'm going to turn it over to Kip Webster, who'll tell you more about what can be done about all of this. Thank you.